Vivian. We'll get started in a few minutes. For those joining us, we're just going to give it another minute or so to let people flow in and click on those links. Maybe their Zoom needs a little updating. All right, we'll get started, and I know those will pop in as we get started, and that's all good. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our GRADnavigate workshop on predatory publishing. So a few notes before I pass it off to Lauren today. As a heads up, this event is being recorded, so we will be able to post a link to it on our website and send it out after the event, so you can check back for material in case you have questions or want to double check something that you learned about today. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen on your Zoom chat, so you can put in questions in there, and we'll have a Q&A session near the end of the event as well. You can also pop questions in the chat. And if you would like to use the closed captioning feature, that is also at the bottom of the screen where you see CC down there. So I'd like to start things off with a territorial acknowledgement. So the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within the Office of Indigenous Relations. So if you're interested about resources and events and training around Indigenous populations, I highly recommend checking out this office. It's super useful, very informative, so go check it out. And then I will also hand things off to Lauren Beil, who is a copyright and licensing librarian, and she is here today to talk about the predatory publishing. So I will hand it off to you, Lauren.
Thank you. As Ashley mentioned, I'm Lauren Beil. I'm the copyright and licensing librarian. You can find me when I'm on campus in the Dana Porter Library. And today I'm going to talk to you about predatory publishing. Generally, I like to frame this discussion as more targeting journals for publication, right? In the sense that we're not avoiding predatory publishing as much as we are choosing a journal that would be good for our work. And so what exactly does that look like? And how can we make sure that we're taking into a bunch of factors of predatory publishing? So today we'll talk about the characteristics of a quality journal, characteristics of predatory or low quality journals, and go through one example of how to assess. If you have questions, I invite you to throw them in the chat along the way. I'm not as great about monitoring the chat and presenting at the same time, so I might come back to them later, but I do intend to answer as many questions as I can. So first, we want to start off with some publishing basics, just to get everybody on the same page about how this process happens. So it gives us a bit of information about how predatory publishing functions and how you might be able to catch these things sort of right off the bat, just based on some standards that you would expect. So as you may very well know, in terms of publishing, you have an author, yourself, maybe a bunch of authors writing a paper, a conference proceeding, putting together a conference presentation, and sending that to a publisher. We'll talk more specifically about journals today and journal publishing, but these things can also apply to conferences as well. So you send that paper that you've written to a journal. At that journal, there is an editor who has a look at your material to see whether or not the material fits within the aims and scope of the journal, and whether or not they think it would be a good thing to send on for peer review. There are usually one or two peer reviewers that have a look at the work. There are many different peer review models, and we can get into that a bit later. After peer review, it will get sent back to the editor with the peer reviewer's recommendations, either to reject the article, to revise and resubmit, or to accept it unconditionally. Then in most cases, we get that revise and resubmit bit, and it gets sent back to the author, whom will do the revisions. They'll send it back to the editor, and then maybe there'll be another round of peer review yet again, depending on the publisher's, the journal's policies. So you can see how this kind of thing can really take up a chunk of time. We've got a lot of people involved with a lot of expertise, and a lot of people involved who have a lot of other things going on. Usually peer reviewers and editors are faculty members, researchers at other institutions who have a lot of other responsibilities in addition to this work that they're doing for the journal. So it's definitely not their first priority a lot of the time. Just before we go on, we'll talk a little bit more about peer review. So there are a number of types. These are the three most common that I'm aware of. So single anonymized, where the reviewers know who you are, but you don't know who the reviewers are. Double anonymized, neither of the reviewers nor the authors know the identity of the other. And open, where everyone knows who everybody else is. Double anonymized is the most common. It is often referred to also as double or single blind. The language is changing a little bit to move away from that more sort of ableist language. So you'll see maybe either single or double blind or single or double anonymized on journal pages when they're describing their peer review processes. Open peer review is less common, but you may see that on a journal page, and it is an accepted form of peer review. So when we're talking about predatory journals, we're often talking about journals that are open access. And this is because open access models have this pay to publish model that is often associated with them. And so if you are in a situation where you're paying the journal to publish the article, there is a opportunity for some deception and for a journal to be set up specifically with the intent of making money off of an author. This is opposed to traditional journals where the journals are sold to libraries or to individuals via subscriptions, and where someone would only continue to subscribe if they were getting value out of the journal, whereas the payment for a publishing interaction would only happen, hopefully, if the author was interested in and thought that there was quality material happening in the journal. So it's a little bit of that different process. So when we're talking about predatory publishing, we're talking about that business of that deception happening, really. It's really about the journal lying to you about the quality of the process they're providing. Generally, it stems around the ability to give you fulsome review of your work. And so oftentimes predatory publishers will be offering quicker turnarounds. The most egregious of them will be offering guaranteed publishing regardless of the quality of the article. So that's a pretty obvious flag. But really we're talking about that sort of deception or lying piece of things, right? They claim to be doing everything a regular journal would be doing, but they're not. They're not offering wholesome peer review. They may not be offering editing services. They may not be copy editing the work. And so what ends up out there is often a less than quality publication, and sometimes the journal itself won't last for very long, like they might be removed from the web at some point. So as I mentioned before, we're going to focus on journals today, but there are also predatory conferences. I've included one example of a major predatory conference on this slide here. It's a WASET, and I'll just head over to my browser and show you what the WASET website looks like. So it's the World Academy of Science, Engineering, and Technology. They're trying to tell if I'm a human. But you can kind of tell just based on the way that their website is set up that they're perhaps less than quality organization in terms of just the sheer volume of conferences that they offer. So let me see if this will load here for me. So you can see here, if you have a look, they have conferences that are happening all over the world. And when you look at the disciplines that they offer, so let's just click on aerodynamics. They have a conference happening, almost June 19th and 20th in Sydney, in Vienna, in Venice, in Toronto, in Chisinau, in Riga. And so you can kind of tell from that they're capitalizing on the number of people who might be able to go to these things. You can have a look for yourself and see if you think they're quality, and we'll talk about some of the ways to assess these things. But for me, this is a major red flag in terms of the volume of the conferences and the number of places that they're offered. So before we go further into sort of these factors of how to select a journal, I wanted to talk to you all about how you select content to read. So if you want to put in the chat where you find material for a literature review or to keep informed on the status of your field. Okay, not seeing anything in the chat, not seeing any sort of hands up or anything. One thing in,
Oh, sorry,
chat is
some of the
disabled.
things,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll skip that then. But sort of generally, folks are selecting content to read and finding content to read based on what is popular in their field. You might be searching Google Scholar, you might be searching different databases. You might select content to read based on people you know in the field as being particularly, well-known or popular, or who have a record of publication in the area. You might select things to read by looking at the citations of other articles you've read. There are all sorts of ways to find information. And so when we're thinking about how we select content to read and how we find content ourselves, we want that to inform how we select where to publish as well. Because the idea generally with publishing is that you want other folks to be able to find your work, to read it and engage with it, maybe to cite you and reuse your work in some way, and then for that to create new connections in the field. Obviously, there are all sorts of citation and sort of research or analytics pieces that can go along with these things in terms of being evaluated as an individual. But I like to focus on that core content piece of folks being able to find your research and engage with it. So the other question I like to ask is, what do you think defines a high quality journal?
The chat is now enabled.
Thank you. So sometimes folks will say that they think that a journal having a high impact factor defines a high quality journal. Yep, rating the people associated with it. Yep. So if you know or you're familiar with the editors or members of the editorial board, if say your supervisor has published there before, or someone who's very prominent in your field has published there before, um, there are all sorts of ways to determine what is a high quality journal. And I find that it overlaps reasonably nicely with how we decide what we like to read. Impact factor and sort of journal ratings is something we'll get into a little bit more further on in the discussion, because there are a number of things to understand about that when you use it as a way to rate something. But it definitely is something that features largely because of the role that it continues to play in the way that tenure and promotion works for researchers in their field. So we're going to talk about the three top factors of how to select a journal before we get into the things that we want to avoid with predatory publishing. So the first part is your content appropriate for the journal? And what I'm really talking about here is looking at the aims and scope of the journal and seeing if the kind of thing that you did your research on or are going to do your research on would fit within the aims and scope of that journal. So for me, there are a number of different journals about academic librarianship. I'm a copyright librarian. There's a journal of copyright and education in librarianship. They cover copyright issues specifically. I write papers on copyright and post-secondary education. My content likely fits in the aims and scope of that journal. And so generally, although not always, the aims and scope of a journal should be fairly specific to a field. And so you should be able to identify that your topic would fit within the aims and scope. If you see a journal that has a really broad aims and scope, so like it just covers everything, like there's some predatory journals that will say they cover social sciences, the humanities, and science, all of them, and won't have any sort of specific aims and scope. What that calls to mind is, does the editor and have the ability to look at papers that come in and assess whether or not they're appropriate for the journal? Do the members of the editorial board have the qualifications and the background that would make them able to assess whether or not content was particularly good or innovative or pushing the edge of the field? And would they be able to identify and select for peer reviewers that would be able to meaningfully give feedback on that article? And if the aims and scope is really broad, it's very difficult to do that. Not impossible, because there are really well-known, fairly high quality journals. So PLOS has some very broad scope journals that folks generally are appreciative of. So it's not impossible, but it requires a lot of management. And so it's something that you should consider as you're selecting your journal. Does your content fit in the aims and scope? So a couple ways you can do this is just A, read the aims and scope, and B, look at the other content in the journal to see if your content is similar. So I would generally say that, well, you obviously don't need to have read everything from the journal. Having read something in the journal is a really good cue that the journal is one that you might consider. If you haven't read anything from the journal, checking out what's published in there and whether or not you think it's of good quality is a good way to start assessing. The second bit is, will others be able to find your work? And this goes to what I was talking about before. How do you find work? How do you find papers to read? When do you think is a quality journal? And so if others think it's a quality journal, if it is indexed and abstract in places where people will find it, that will help your work be found and engaged with. And that's the goal of publishing our research, is to make sure that other people can get access to our findings. And so in the library world, we refer to indexing. So this is having the journal included in databases where other people can search with keywords to find content. Google Scholar is an index of a bunch of journals, and it is fairly broad. There are other databases that are more specific and have more in-depth quality requirements for inclusion in the database. So for example, there are a couple of really large indexes, Scopus and Web of Science, that include a number of journals, and they have a set of criteria for whether or not a journal is high quality enough to be included in the index. There are also subject-specific databases that have very particular content index. There's, for example, indices of business materials in ABI Inform, which is a ProQuest database on business content. There are similar databases in almost any field that you can think of. I'm not going to go through them now. But if you think about where you're searching for material, or even where your librarian might search for material, you can think about, is the journal indexed in that source? And oftentimes the publisher will tell you where the journal is indexed. So I'm just going to pop over and show you an example of that. Okay. So this is the Journal of Academic Librarianship. It may not be a particularly good example of indexing, but you can see here at the very bottom under abstracting and indexing, it says that it's indexed in Scopus and the Social Sciences Citation Index. So the Social Sciences Citation Index is part of the Web of Science database. So this journal is indexed in both very large academic databases that we would rely on. Importantly, being indexed in Web of Science means that the journal will have an impact factor. So if you're looking for something to have an impact factor, it has to be indexed in Web of Science in order for that to be true. Another tool that you can use is Ulrich's Global Serials Directory. It's a tool that librarians would commonly use to understand more about the history of a journal, but you can also use it to find where content is indexed. So I'll just show you that very briefly. It's a tool that you have access to through the library. So you could search for a journal here. I'm just going to search cognition. And it looks like. There we go. So you can see here, Elsevier is the publisher of Cognition. It has electronic content online. It's peer-reviewed. That's what this means here. And then you can open up the record and have a look at all of the places where it's indexed. So Web of Science, it says the coverage has dropped, and Scopus. So this is only in index and Scopus according to Ulrichs. The third component is how content is selected and reviewed. So this is that peer review part. This is probably the most complicated piece of assessing a journal because it involves sort of more detective work than a lot of the other pieces. So the journal should have a list of their members of their editorial board, and the editor should have the required expertise and credentials to evaluate the work within the journal scope. So for instance, if for the Journal of Academic Librarianship, they had a list of an editorial board members and the editorial board members were medical doctors or nurses or social workers, I would say, oh, those people might not have the expertise to understand what's happening in the field of academic librarianship. They might not be able to assess whether or not my work is good or not, or know people in the field who are able to comment on the work in terms of the peer review process. And so that's a pretty extreme example, but with some of these predatory journals, you can see sort of a very wide mix of people as editorial board members. And when you're thinking about the aims and scope, those people should have credentials that make sense for them to be able to have a look at a paper and go, yes, this is a good paper. It's good enough to send on for peer review. Or yes, I know people in the field who would do a peer review on this paper. So more importantly, in terms of predatory journals, there should be no guarantee of acceptance. The process should be conditional on the outcome of peer review and any required or requested revisions from the author on the paper. So any guarantee of acceptance on a paper is a sign of a predatory journal and not a journal you should publish in. There should also be no guarantee of short peer review time. So when we're thinking about this, there are some journals that prioritize faster review, and that's perfectly fine. But a guarantee about a specific timeline is often a sign of a predatory journal, especially if those times don't make any sense in terms of what we think about happening in the process, right? We know that an editor has to receive it, have a look at it at least enough to see if it fits within the journal's aims and scope. They have to find peer reviewers, and the peer reviewers have to read their email and respond and read the article and go through and provide feedback. That can only happen on a very on a certain timeline. If they say 2 days, it's probably not going to happen in 2 days. So in that case, you have an inkling that maybe it's not happening at all, or if it is happening and it's happening at a very high level and they're not actually engaging with the work. So you can have a look at the members of the editorial board and see what credentials are listed. Oftentimes, predatory journals will also list people just because they think it will look good rather than because they're actually editorial board members. And so sometimes I'll try and check a person's CV or website to see if they list an affiliation with the journal. They don't always do that. I mean, folks don't always update their CVs or their websites to reflect all of the things they're doing. So it's not an eliminating factor, but it's a good way of seeing, is there someone who actually will claim, especially an editor-in-chief, if an editor-in-chief isn't claiming that they're the editor-in-chief of a particular journal, it might be a hint that it's a predatory journal. So next I'll go through some additional factors. And so what I wanted to say is all of these things act together, right? So aside from the guarantee of publication, most of these factors are sort of a combination, and you look at them together to understand whether or not something is more on the predatory side of a continuum or on the other side of the continuum, right? All journals exist on this continuum from predatory to high quality. And most journals, just by the nature of there being so very many of them, are going to exist somewhere in the middle, right? We have the nature and the science on this high quality and prestigious side, and there are probably journals like specific to your field that you would know fit into that bucket. And a lot of people want to publish in them, but very few people do. And so we're publishing our content in other kinds of journals, the less high quality journals. That doesn't mean they're bad. And it certainly doesn't mean they're predatory, but they exist somewhere in this medium quality. And then there are low quality journals that do peer review and do editorial checks, but they're not predatory. They're not trying to deceive you. They're just, a less high quality, less rigorous organization than some of the other journals. It's really the deception that we're trying to avoid, especially in terms of your work being found and existing in the long term. So again, these are all factors that work together. No one of them is going to stand out as something that immediately rejects a journal as predatory. But if you can have a look at the journal history, if it's been established for longer, you'll have more evidence to go on. So it's not to say that all journals that have existed for 10 years or more are definitely not predatory, but it is to say that there's more to work with, and the chances of them being predatory over a longer period of time are a bit lower. It's also not to say that brand new journals are immediately predatory. So again, you're using these factors all together. Is the journal associated with a scholarly society or trade organization or a university? So that might weigh pretty heavily in the factor of being predatory or not. If the journal is associated with, say, IEEE or the Association for Computing Machinery or something like that, then it's usually fairly clear that the journal isn't predatory. It may still exist somewhere on the quality spectrum, but it's probably not predatory. You might also look at a journal's membership in publishing organizations such as the Committee on Publication Ethics or the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. This isn't necessarily, again, a definitive factor because some of these organizations require payment from a journal, and if the journal is smaller or newer, they may not have funds for this, but it can be an indication that the journal follows particular standards. You want to have a look at the website content. We're hoping here to see evidence of care and high professional standards for the way that the content is displayed. While we definitely don't want to be prejudiced against or biased against journals who are published in English as a second language for the journal editors, we do want to be looking for evidence that the content has been carefully put together. Sometimes that involves grammar and typographical errors. A lot of times it's like missing links, dead links, links to bad places. So like falsifying data through using sort of these false services, and I'll show you an example of that later. That kind of thing. The website being a bit of a mess. It is kind of more of a vibe check, honestly, than anything else. But it can be, like I say, just one component of the way that you can assess a journal. Is there care put into this website? One thing that is fairly standard that folks should look for is the International Standard Serial Number, the ISSN. It is a number that is associated with a journal being registered with a few different organizations, particularly an organization called ISSN Portal. If a journal has an ISSN, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not predatory, but oftentimes predatory journals will claim to have an ISSN but not have one, so they'll just make one up, and that can be a sign of a falsified or predatory journal. You're going to want the copyright policy to be clear. That's the case for all journals, not just predatory journals. But particularly with open access journals, usually the publisher will leave copyright in the hands of the author. If the publisher is seeking to have copyright transferred, that's a red flag for me. Then we'll think about review speed and acceptance rate. So these are more factors that kind of depend on where you are at and what you're looking to achieve. So while predatory journals will sometimes guarantee review speed, which is something we want to avoid and often speak to really fast reviewing, which may be a key for it being predatory. You may also be thinking about this just from the perspective of wanting to publish a paper, for example, before you graduate. You may be building a manuscript-based thesis and want to include a bunch of papers in your thesis, and you need to get that done before a certain period of time. So some journals will offer some information about their review speed and acceptance rates, and you can use that as a indicator of whether or not this is a journal you might want to submit to, given the constraints that you're under. So I'm just going to show you some of the larger publishers will have this information available on their website. So again, this is an example from the Journal of Academic Librarianship. This is a journal with Elsevier, a large multinational publisher, so you can get a sense of the resources they have available to them. But they have available a publishing timeline. So they're saying the editor is going to make a decision within 8 days of submission. On average, it'll take 63 days for peer reviewers to review. On average, it takes 82 days to get from submission to acceptance. And after you get your acceptance, it takes 9 days to get published. So if you're looking at a few journals, particularly within larger publishers that might have this information available, Wiley and Springer, I believe, also have this information available. You could say, okay, I have 82 days plus 9 days to get things done, or that's not going to work for me. Some of these numbers will get quite large. There are journals that take almost a year to see submission to acceptance, and you can say, okay, that's a journal I don't have time to submit to, even if I do think it would be a really good venue for my work. We talked a little bit earlier about impact factor and sort of journal rankings, and impact factor is the most popular one, probably the one you've heard about the most. An impact factor is a number based on the average number of times the articles from a journal have been that have been published in the past 2 years for what impact factor, or 3 years for what Scopus site score. have been cited in those years. So, for example, the average number of times articles from the journal Nature have been cited in Web of Science in the past 2 years is 64.8 times. So that number can be sometimes manipulated in some ways, and oftentimes it's used to score or evaluate individuals rather than journals, and that's an example of something it should not be used for. And so we try to warn people against that in terms of folks saying, oh, I have to publish in XYZ impact factor journal because if I don't, I won't get tenure. That is sometimes a reality of the way that the academic tenure and promotion works, unfortunately. But generally, that's not what it's intended for. It's intended for is to give you a sense of how well is the journal comparing against other journals in that field, an apples to apples comparison. So you can't really compare nuclear physics B and Nature to each other because they're in two entirely different sort of sets of two entirely different fields. And you can't even really compare site score to impact factor because of the way that the information is based, right? So we have just sources in Web of Science or just sources in Scopus. So it's not even looking at the full spectrum of academic work. It's just looking at journals that are included in those databases, which have very specific requirements and oftentimes don't include, by the very nature of them, new things, right? So if a journal doesn't have 2 years of history, it's simply not included in the factor. So while you can look at impact factor or site score as a way to get an understanding of a journal, it's certainly not something that we recommend using on its own to indicate whether or not something is quality. I think this just covers the things that I have lightly ranted about. We'll skip this slide, but I do plan on handing the slides out afterwards. I'll send them to Ashley. And then just finally to go over some red flags. So if you're sent a spam like email for asking for a submission, so something totally out of the blue, someone you don't know and don't know personally or don't even know in the field, that's generally a red flag. I can't think of any sort of situation other than if you've requested to be added to a list for that specific purpose where a unsolicited email asking for submission is a good thing. The journal isn't indexed where it claims to be. So oftentimes a journal will list a number of databases where it claims to be indexed and they're just not true. So it's a good thing to verify. The journal lists an impact factor or site score that is not verifiable. So again, this continues with this theme of the journal lying to you. So they'll say, oh, our impact factor is 5.4, counting on you to not check to see if they indeed do have an impact factor. So it's a good thing to verify with the source. So go straight to Web of Science or Scopus to see if the journal is listed there. Again, publication is guaranteed. Anything where publication is guaranteed is immediately a predatory journal. The journal name is misleading. So this one is a rather rare one, but oftentimes if you see a journal that has a name that's really close to a journal name that is really popular in your field, it's worth investigating a little bit further. There have been some well-known scams with the journal Nature, and some of the Springer Nature branded titles. I think it's more of like an earlier career issue with folks who don't have much experience in their field and they get misled, unfortunately. Usually they're cleaned up fairly quickly because of the trademark issues that they present for the companies, but I like to include it in here anyways. And then anything where the publication charges are unclear or required before acceptance. So often, again, they're lying to you in order to get your money, right? They want you to pay to publish. And so if they're looking for you to pay before acceptance, they're often going to just take your money and not publish your article at all. Another factor around payment is asking for significantly lower article processing charges than other journals. So while this, again, isn't always something that disqualifies a journal as predatory, it can just be an indicator that they can afford to just accept masses of content without any ramifications, whereas other journals accept much fewer articles, and so they charge a higher rate in order to offset their costs. So the average article processing charge across sort of very broad scopes of journals is about $3,000 USD. And so if you see an article processing charge that is really low and they're not providing some kind of explanation for that, it can be a bit of a red flag in terms of they're just trying to process as many articles as possible. So this is an example of a publisher email. So I get them all the time. Almost as soon as you publish anything, you'll start to be on a list of people who get these. I'm sure some of you get them yourselves. So this one here, is addressed to me as a doctor. I don't have a PhD. From the Journal of Tourism and Sports Management, apparently on special recommendation from their prestigious founding editor-in-chief. Great. I don't have any experience in tourism and sports management. I am very much a librarian. I've not done any work in tourism and sports management before. So why Professor Brendan Chen would provide a special recommendation for me, it just doesn't make any sense. They really appreciate my work and the quality of research that I've done in the field of tourism and sports management. Again, I have not done any of this work. So they do highlight an article I have published, but I think you could probably tell based on the title, comparing author use of copyright addenda with publisher acceptance, that it has nothing to do with tourism and sports management. So oftentimes these things will be really obvious like this, and you can just click the delete button and get rid of it. Sometimes, though, just by the very nature of the way that these things work, it will come through in a field that you are affiliated with. And so if you're not receiving them all the time and you accidentally get the wrong one as the first one and you go, oh yeah, that's really wonderful that I might have an opportunity to publish in this journal that's related to my work. Just double check the journal, have a look at their website and go through some of the factors that we talked about today. Most of the time you can just hit the delete button. Yes, and again, we have this message that is at the bottom that says the message has been sent to me because of your eminence in the field. Again, no eminence in the field, no eminence in any field, to be quite clear. So I wanted to go through an example today. It's the South Florida Journal of Development. They have emailed me several times trying to get me to submit to them. And so I've just gone through some of the factors here. I'm just going to go to the website and work through some of these factors in real time. And then you can have a look at this afterwards. And I'm just going to pop back over to the chat to see if there are any questions. Yeah, so in terms of the website links, like for Ulrich's, I think you would mean. Happy to share those links. And Vivian asking, does it mean all the journals that charge you a fee are bad? Absolutely not. So journals that charge fees for open access publishing are incredibly common across all fields. So for example, the journal Nature will charge an open access fee for making articles in that journal open access on a sort of voluntary basis by the authors. The fee that they charge for that is around $11,000 US. And so obviously I think we're all fairly familiar with the journal Nature. It's a very high quality journal. That's why they charge so much for something to be open access. I will show you, the library does provide we have agreements with with publishers that provide discounts or coverage for open access fees. So So I'm not going to get too much into the open access fee, like why you might need to publish open access, that kind of thing today, but you can talk to your supervisor about if there are requirements to publish open access. Often they're associated with your supervisor's grants. So if your supervisor has a grant for their research from the tri-agencies, there will be some kind of open access requirement with that. But if you want to see if there is an open access discount or coverage through the library's agreements, you can search our journal search tool here. It's this big button at the top. You can also scroll through and see which publishers that we have agreements with. But if you have a journal name in mind, I would just recommend using the journal search tool. And then you go through and search for a journal name. I'm going to try engineering just generally. So if I wanted to publish open access for the open access fee in engineering geology with the publisher Elsevier, the library covers that fee. And so we can have a look at, I think this links straight out to the journal. So this journal has a article publishing charge of $4,210 USD, and so the library's agreement would cover that charge if you wanted to publish your article open access. I don't know enough about engineering geology to know where it sits on the continuum, but the chances of it being predatory or near zero. Elsevier generally has a very good reputation as a academic publisher. There's a different reputation maybe in libraries just because of how big they are and how much they want to charge, but they're generally pretty responsible about the way that they publish. Okay, so we're just going to have a look then at the the South Florida Journal of Development. And so let me just see if I can pull up here. So this is just one of the many emails I have received from the South Florida Journal of Development. They congratulate me and my co-authors on a paper that we've written, and they want us to publish in the South Florida Journal of Development because of that paper. As far as I can tell, our article on machine learning, corpora, and fair dealing has nothing to do with the topics that the South Florida Journal of Development covers. And they talk about having a fee of $85 USD, which would be really nice if this was a good journal. But again, as I was saying, it sort of raised my red flags in terms of this being sort of out of spec with the general number of journals that charge much higher costs. It's also kind of interesting that they say, after accepting invitation, reply to this email informing of the interest and the chosen type of payment. So they're already getting towards payment before we've even submitted anything. So first, we're going to have a look at the aims and scope for the journal. And so I tried to find something called aims and scope on this website and couldn't. The general information that they have is that is how the journal came to be, and it rose through some professors' perception of the lack of means of dissemination in the development subject in scientific articles. I think it's about economic development, but I had a really hard time sussing that out when I was going through the website. So I would definitely say that the aims and scope, if not leaning towards predatory, definitely leans towards a little bit too broad. And it doesn't give me any cues about whether or not my paper is going to be a good fit for the journal. So I also look for an ISSN, so they have one listed here. When I searched Ulrichs for this, it produced no results. And so it's not included in the Ulrichs serials database, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it's not definitively kicking it out. They do have an ISSN as provided by the ISSN portal, so you can find that just by searching the ISSN in Google, it will almost always do a calculation of the two numbers. And then usually the second result will be the ISSN portal result. So then you can have a look and see, what country it's from, what the title is, and who at ISSN is responsible for the record. So that makes sense because the country of origin is Brazil. Although it gives me some questions about why it's called the South Florida Journal of Development. One interesting piece here, as I was going through my investigation, was that they call attention to the fact that it's published by the South Florida Publishing LLC. And then it says that I can view the Florida State Company registration when you click here. And it links to this SunBiz site. When I went there, it says that the entity, South Florida Publishing LLC, is inactive, and the last event was a voluntary dissolution. So if they wouldn't have linked to this, I wouldn't have checked it, but because they did, I'm here. And I had a look at the voluntary dissolution paperwork, and it says we no longer have a reason to keep this corporation open. So I don't know what any of that means in terms of a journal. I would assume that at least the business entity piece of it has been abandoned. That person listed on this dissolution article, Edelson Cataplan, is no longer the editor-in-chief of the journal, so maybe that's why. When we look at the editorial team, we can see that Daniel Molina Botash is now the editor-in-chief, so maybe he's setting something up alternatively. But it doesn't give me a lot of faith that the website is being kept up to date. So I did have a difficult time verifying information about the editorial team's expertise. Does seem to be relatively diverse, and I had a hard time getting a sense of their research agenda. There was at least one person, Liliana Rodriguez, who called out on her ORCID ID that she was affiliated with the journal, which is generally a good sign. We've got real people who are willing to associate themselves with the journal. But I had a hard time otherwise identifying whether or not these folks would have the area of expertise to evaluate content for the journal, both because it was difficult to find information about them and because the journal doesn't really have a great aims and scope. The journal has been around since 2020, which I found by looking at the back issues area and just sort of scrolling back to the beginning. So it does have a bit of a history. So if I was looking to publish in it, I would recommend going through some of the articles that are published in the journal and seeing if they have any relevance to the kind of things that you're publishing on. A lot of the content seems to be published in Spanish. So although they do say they publish in English as well. So if you are unable to read it for that reason, maybe that would put it in a category that's a little out of scope for you. If you can't you can't read the content, I would generally recommend, unless you know it's really good quality, to stick to things where you can have a better chance of evaluating. Another thing we want to look at is whether or not the indexing and abstracting of the content is accurate and covers places where we would expect it to be. So one of the more common things for predatory journals is that they'll list a bunch of services that either index things for free and automatically, like Google Scholar, and the sort of academic search engine services, and whether or not they list things that have sort of inaccurate links or misleading links. So here it says impact factor, which didn't make any sense to me because impact factor isn't really a service. It's based on Web of Science, and the way you would check an impact factor is by going through a service called Journal Citation Reports. And so if I click this link, I end up on this page, General Impact Factor, and it doesn't really say anything. It just has a empty sort of form, I guess, is the best way I would describe it. It has some information on evaluation for some fee. I don't really understand what this is offering. And it certainly isn't telling me whether or not this journal has an impact factor or telling me what the impact factor is. And it's not a place that I'm familiar with for searching and finding information for sure. They list the Scope database, which seems very close to Scopus, which seems like sort of a bit of a trick to me. It's not indexed in either of Web of Science or Scopus. And so this is a Web of Science search here. I just did a search for publication titles and South Florida Journal of Development and found no results. So I think that would be pretty important to me in terms of maybe somebody will find me in Google Scholar, but in terms of other popular databases, it's not coming up here. I think that's most of sort of the concerning things. Their copyright policy is a little bit off in that the journal becomes the copyright holder of published articles for open access content. That's not usually the case, but it's not completely eliminating, as they do assign a Creative Commons license to the article, which would allow people to use it freely afterwards anyways, but it is uncommon. And then we can have a look at the peer review policy. They do state a double-blind review system. So that is, it's not as reassuring if you don't know, exactly how the process is followed and you can't verify the editorial board members, but at least they have it outlined here. One thing that did give me pause is it says that this the stage of the evaluation process can last up to the month, and that doesn't seem like enough time for me. It's not a few days, but it's not quite that sort of 82 days that we were looking at with the Journal of Academic Librarianship. These things will vary, and it definitely depends on the area of study, trying to figure out what's normal and what's not. But a month just generally seems like a bit of too short of a time period for a full submission to review acceptance period. Okay, I'm gonna have a look at the chat and see if there are any questions. Okay. So one of the things I will say is that, I'm giving this presentation today because I like to get information out there about how to select journals to publish, because in terms of copyright, it can be really important. A lot of the questions I end up getting about this are, I've signed an agreement with one of these journals. Now what do I do? How do I get my work back? And unfortunately, that's not the way it works. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this. But I am not really your go-to person. The people you want to be talking to about where to publish and what journals are good journals are people who have experience in your field. And so unless your field is copyright and librarianship, I am not your gal. You want to be talking to your colleagues, so other people you're doing research with, folks who have a little bit more experience than you are usually good, your supervisor, or your liaison librarian. So every department has a liaison librarian associated with it. That person has expertise in your subject, maybe not your niche subject, but the general subject. So they would know more about the journals in the field because they have a hand in selecting the material that we accrue in the library. And they make those decisions based on whether or not content is quality or not. And so they have that expertise of assessing these things. If you have sort of a more general question about, is this ISSN real, or, does this sort of look sketchy to you? I can try to help with that kind of thing, but generally you're better to talk to someone who has subject expertise about these things. And the people around you doing work in your field are the best people to ask. So this is a list of all the images I've used in the presentation. That's really all that I have today. It's a lot of content really quickly. And so I'm very open to any questions you might have about how to get started with any kind of assessment.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So again, you can put your questions in the chat or the Q&A function as well. I found this presentation really helpful too, and there are some resources. So I'm currently trying to get some of the work for my dissertation published, and I've been having some issues navigating some of the journals myself, especially because I realized over the last year, I feel like it's becoming more common practice for those article processing fees. Like I feel like more and more journals are putting those out, and it's kind of off-putting, especially for someone who is, I don't have grants to be publishing, right? So it's definitely become
Yeah.
more obstacle, especially for grad students, I imagine, for in the publishing world.
Yeah, no, the publishing fees are becoming more and more common as open access publishing becomes more and more commonly required by funders. It's often not associated with a graduate student's funding for their work. So if you have a scholarship from somewhere, usually it's not associated with requirement for open access. But a lot of grants require open access publishing, particularly from the tri-agency. If you're NIH funded they require open access publishing. So those fees are becoming a way for publishers to offer that service because they're not getting the subscription fee, right? If something is openly available to everyone. So they have to make money somehow. Whether or not they have to make $3,000 an article is another question. But that's the reality of the market right now. And so the library's agreements are one way that we're trying to help people out with that. And it's working right now. We'll see how it continues to go as our agreements with publishers change. But if you do have questions about those agreements, I am the person to ask about that. So you can always send me an email. And I just wanted to highlight here, we have in our online learning object repository, we have a decision tree for evaluating journals for publication. And we also have a related set of modules that covers a lot of the things that I went over today, like pretty much the same, but you can do it in your own time. And it has some sort of like quizzes and stuff to check your knowledge and all that kind of fun stuff. So if this was a bit too much too fast, the modules might be more your pace.
Awesome. I mean, I see the question in the Q&A about whether you'll get the slides. I think, yeah, Lauren mentioned that she'd be happy to send them to me and I can send them out. And this session was recorded as well, so everything that Lauren was talking about that might not be actually explicitly written on the slides, you'll have access to as well. Any other questions? All right, so while you're thinking of your last questions, I do want to mention we do have some upcoming GRADnavigate events, as well as an outdoor games event for PhD students and postdocs, where you can also bring your families along as well. So I'm going to post the link in the chat to some upcoming events we have. We have one on supervisory relationships coming up on July 8th, and then July 10th is the outdoor games event. And then in August, we have a GRADnavigate event on the BU programming that Campus Wellness has launched. So if that's of interest, check those out. And Lauren is putting some more links in the chat as well if you want to grab those.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Almost makes me wish I was a graduate student.
And the supervisory relationships event has pizza, so bonus. All right, I think students have started popping off and I don't see any other questions. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Lauren, for presenting on this.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone.